Okay, so as you can see, the bike build has started, but as I suspected, I wouldn't be able to finish this build this weekend. Work has been busy and enough with those excuses. So I decided to make a separate video of all the tools that I use to build up a bike. I will also throw in a few extras that I think some people might find useful. And as you will see, while I have some expensive tools, I try to be as budget friendly as I can with my tool choices and not spend unnecessary money on stuff that truly doesn't need to be anything special. Specific bike brand tools, although they are nice, unless you're sponsored or have a lot of money, you can get away a lot cheaper for sure. So let's start with the basic tools and move on from there. So the staple of every bike toolkit is of course the Hex Key Set. And the easiest way to get all your bases covered is one of these sets from 1.5mm up to 10mm. That span will cover pretty much everything you can find on the bike. Me personally, I like to have a mini set as well, especially when using the 1.5 to 3mm. I like to have a bit smaller tools to work with. Another thing I can really recommend, but it's not totally necessary, is having a set of T-handle hex keys, as it will make your life a lot easier. I only have 4 and 5mm, and that covers like 80-90% of all the work I do. In a perfect world, I will probably want a 6mm as well, but 4 and 5mm is good enough for me, at least for now. I also use this T-Ratchet with a bit set, and this basically covers all my needs for Torques, Phillips head screws, flathead screws you might find on some bike parts. You can usually find these sets pretty cheap online, and in my opinion, you don't really need to get anything too expensive here. And speaking of not expensive, this screwdriver set I actually got from a 100 yen store. And while the T-Ratchet has me covered for the most part, sometimes it's nice to have some smaller drivers to work with. And this has actually been working really good. You might have seen this in a few videos of mine. Usually it's for removing screws from brake pads and such. I use a normal box cutter to cut my brake hoses, and a pair of scissors, so always good to have. Cutting bar tape, for example. I have one adjustable wrench, and the only place I really use this is when pressing in my bottom bracket. I know it looks very pro to have all those cone wrenches lined up on your pegboard. In my experience, unless you work on older bikes, it's a complete waste to spend a lot of money on cone wrenches. Stop. Of course, I realized I missed an important part. You actually need this, a 7 and an 8mm spanner for the brake hose nuts and the bleed nut as well. Shame on me. Apart from that, you don't need any other spanners or cone wrenches, I hope. Back to me. Other stuff I don't spend a lot of money on is, for example, this Pliers, 100 yen store. You might see a pattern developing here. Also got my big rubber mallet for tapping in cranks, and a small hammer for tapping in the inserts into the brake hoses. These are also about the cheapest hammers I could find, as the work they will do is about as simple as it can be, and I rather spend money on more important tools. And while I don't need this when I'm building up a bike with Di2 and hydraulic brakes, I still thought I would mention this, because if you're using mechanical shifters or mechanical brakes, you will need a wire cutter like this. The good thing about this particular model from Jagwire is you have this little peg in the handle that you use when you cut the wire housing. Usually after the cut, it's a bit deformed at the end, so you just put the housing on this peg to make it nice and round again. Of course, if you want to go a bit cheaper, a normal wire cutter does the job as well. So that's all the basic tools covered, and now let's move on to some more special ones. And a good place to start is torque wrenches. I would highly recommend getting a torque wrench, at least for the lower torque requirements, especially carbon parts like clamping stems onto carbon steers and carbon handlebars, seat posts and stuff like that. And especially if you're messing around with weight weenie level carbon parts, a torque wrench is essential. And while I love my Park Tool torque wrench, cheaper alternatives like this style is better than nothing. It doesn't have to cost an arm and a leg. And usually with these torque wrenches you can use the bit set that I showed you before. In this case these are Torques and screwdrivers, so I have another set with hex bits as well. For the bigger torque requirements I have this Topeak torque wrench that goes up to 60 Newton meters, and I love this thing. I actually don't use it as much as I thought I would. You could argue that once you're up to the torque values around 40 to 50 Newton meters, being that accurate might not be as big of a deal as at the lower torque values. So yeah, I leave that decision up to you. I love this torque wrench, but I wouldn't say it is the most important tool I have in my toolbox. It does give you a peace of mind when torquing down cranks, cassettes, brake rotors and parts like that. I do use the bit set that comes with the torque wrench together with my smaller wrench though, so there's always that. So moving on to the special bike specific tools. A chain cutter or a chain tool is a must when building up a bike. Even if you use a quick link, you still need to cut the chain to length. You also need a cassette tool to put on the cassette. In my case, I need an external bottom bracket tool to tighten down the lock ring for my front brake rotor, as I can't use the internal ones. And as I showed you in another video, I also need this ISIS bottom bracket tool to put on the chain ring on my Eastern crank. I also need this bottom bracket bearing press. This is a pretty cheap alternative from, I think it's Bike Hand or something like that. I will put some links in the description for a few different alternatives. The good thing about this one, it basically covers me for 30mm spindles, for BSA, Shimano and even GXP SRAM bottom brackets. So hopefully this will work. This will be the first time I try it out though, so we'll see once we get to that stage of the build. Next on the list is my homemade Di2 routing tool made with a simple steel wire and a brake hose ferrule. I have a previous video showing exactly how I did this, but it's seriously super simple. Just take the steel wire, thread the ferrule on, do a little hook so you can't remove the ferrule, and you're done. I also use this Di2 Cable connector tool just to make life a bit easier when connecting cables in tight spaces. Usually you get these every time you buy something Di2, so you should definitely have this if you have bought any Di2 components. Depending on your pedals, you might need a pedal wrench as well. I don't, as I'm using Shimano pedals that you can mount with a hex key, but I will still show it here just in case. A chain whip is actually not really necessary for building up a bike, but eventually you might need to remove that cassette, so I thought I would just mention it as well. When building up a brand new bike, you will most likely have to cut the stereo tube, so one of these saw guides is a lifesaver. Even if you do it only once, I think it's seriously worth buying. Pair that together with a vise, it will make the job of cutting the stereo tube so much easier. To do the actual cutting, I use a regular hacksaw that I got from a hardware store. It's a pretty cheap one, nothing special at all. It's a 24 TPI blade and it's been working good for me for the last 10 stereo tubes and seat posts I cut, so no need to go crazy and buy some bike brand specific one, in my opinion. I will also use that vise when I hammer in the inserts into my brake hoses using the yellow hose blocks that you get when you buy new hoses. So the vise will make your life easier in more than one way. To install the Shimano disc brakes, I will use a bleed kit containing a syringe, a rubber hose, the bleed funnel and the funnel adapter that comes with the SDI levers, a bleed block for the brake caliper and the tire lever to push the pistons in if needed. You also need mineral oil in case of Shimano and DOT fluid if it's SRAM. I will put some links in the description for some bleed kits for both if you're interested. Moving on to the greasy stuff. For this build I decided to go with the Park Tool Polylube 1000, as it sounds like it's from the Terminator. Previous builds I've been using Shimano Premium Lube and some lithium grease from time to time as well. It all works the same though. I will also use some fiber grips for my carbon parts, mainly the seat post, and some cleaning solution like this aerosol chain cleaner. It's good for cleaning off the mess that can be left after bleeding the brakes, for example. Loctite can be good to have. I don't use it that much. Most bolts you get now are prepped from the factory, but it's always good to have just in case. One thing missing from this picture is something you might have seen me using in other build videos and maintenance videos, is the Wacos brake protector that I used to install barn brackets. I didn't have that at hand while recording this video. I will just use this placeholder, but it's a very important part for a creak-free life. I almost forgot, I also use electrical tape and masking tape. Electrical tape for the bar tape, and masking tape I use to like just temporarily secure wires and hoses and stuff like that if need be, so it's good to have. These last two pieces of equipment is probably just as important as all the other stuff I'll be talking about. Paper towels, preferably these workshop level paper towels that can absorb anything from oil to solvents and stuff like that. And lastly, the rubber gloves that you can see probably in most of my maintenance videos. These are a godsend when you're messing around with oil and grease and stuff like that. Cheap in like a big 100 pack on Amazon as well, so check the description for links. Also, I should mention that a work stand is a pretty good thing to have. In my case, I have one of these race style stands, which is not really the optimal stand for an open, as the barn bracket is kind of sketchy, but I prefer this kind of stand as it's easier to turn the bike around and stuff. You only need any kind of stand that keeps your bike in place while you're working on it. So as you can see there's actually a lot of tools that goes into building up a bike. Luckily, there's a lot of cheaper alternatives. Hopefully you found some inspiration from that list. Of course, depending on your bike and wheels and everything, there might be some different tools you need. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you think I left something out. Oh, speaking of leaving something out, there's one more thing I forgot about. You need a pump to pump up the tires. I think that's it for all the tools. Hopefully I will be able to finish up this build soonish. If you found this video interesting or helpful, leave a like, subscribe if you feel like it. It's always appreciated. And I will catch you in the next one. Hopefully with a bike between my legs.